There's a specific kind of loss that has no professional name. It's not burnout. It's not career anxiety. It's not resistance to change, even though that's what you've probably been told it is. It's what happens when something you spent years learning to do well gets partially replicated by a tool that anyone can access for free. And the reason it's so disorienting is that no one in the professional world will let you call it what it actually is. They will call it disruption. They will call it opportunity. They will tell you to lean in, upskill, adapt, evolve. What they will not do is pause long enough to acknowledge that something real happened to you, and that the feeling you've been carrying since it did is not irrational, not unprofessional, and not a sign that you are the wrong kind of person for this moment. This video is about that feeling, not as a stage to move through quickly on the way to productivity tips, as something that deserves to be named precisely, because precision is the only thing that actually helps. By the end of this, you'll have a name for what you've been feeling, a clear understanding of why it makes complete sense, and a reframe that makes the path forward possible without requiring you to pretend the loss never happened. Let's start with what it actually feels like. Not in the abstract, in the body, in the workday, in the specific moment it hit. For some people, it was a demonstration. A colleague ran a prompt and produced something that took you 3 hours last week. For some, it was a deliverable, a piece of writing, a visual, an analysis that came back from a tool looking close enough to write that you had to sit with what close enough meant. For others, it was slower. A creeping awareness over months that the thing you were good at was becoming something anyone could approximate. The feeling that followed wasn't simple. It wasn't just fear of job loss, though that was in there. It was something more specific and harder to name. Something that felt like watching a relationship end before you had the vocabulary to call it a relationship. Here is the part that never gets said out loud. The craft was not just a skill. It was a record of who you were at work. Every piece of writing you struggled through and finally got right. Every visual that took 12 iterations before the proportions worked. Every analysis where you caught the thing the data didn't obviously show. Those weren't just outputs. They were proof. Proof that the years you spent learning this, the failures, the refinements, the slow accumulation of judgment, meant something that was specifically yours. Research on professional identity consistently shows that high-skill workers don't just invest time in their craft, they invest self. The skill and the self become structurally entangled. Which is why when the skill is threatened, it doesn't feel like a performance review. It feels like a verdict on something much more personal. That's not a dramatic reading of what happened. That's the accurate one. And the reason it matters to name it this precisely is that the feeling you've been managing, the one you've been told is resistance or fear of change or a failure to see the opportunity, is actually grief. Professional grief. Specific, legitimate, proportional grief. And it has been going almost entirely unacknowledged in every professional conversation happening around you. Here's what made it harder. Not the tools. The framing around the tools. The moment I started visibly automating creative and analytical work, a very particular cultural script activated in professional spaces. And that script had exactly one register: optimism, opportunity, augmentation. The future of work is exciting. Professionals who adapt will thrive. This is the moment to lean in. And somewhere in that landscape, you were sitting with a feeling that had no place in any of those conversations. So you did what experienced professionals learn to do. You performed the adaptation. You nodded in the meeting. You bookmarked the tools. You told your manager you were exploring the space. You did not say, "I feel like something I spent years building just got partially erased, and I don't know who I am at work without it," because that sentence has no home in the professional optimism script. And the cost of that, of carrying a grief that has no professional name in a landscape that refuses to acknowledge it exists, is a specific kind of exhaustion that is very different from burnout. It's the exhaustion of double labor, doing the work, and simultaneously performing a relationship to the work that isn't true. Studies on emotional labor consistently show that the gap between felt emotion and performed emotion is one of the most draining experiences in professional life. Not because the feeling is overwhelming, because hiding it requires constant, invisible effort. And here's what that performed adaptation produced over time. Not integration. Not fluency. A low-grade, chronic sense of fraudulence. The feeling of being someone who was supposed to have figured this out in a world where everyone else appeared to already have. The implementation gap. The tutorial loop. The 40 videos watched and nothing at work actually changed. That's not a motivation problem. That's what happens when you're trying to move forward while carrying an unacknowledged loss in both hands. You can't integrate something that you haven't been allowed to grieve. And for most professionals navigating this transition, the grief never got its 5 minutes. It went straight from, "This is happening," to, "Here are the tools you should be learning." That skipped step is expensive. It's what's been making the integration harder than the content, the courses, and the prompt lists can account for. Now for the reframe. Not the reassuring one, the honest one. The grief is real. That's the first part. And it does not get minimized on the way to the useful insight. What you lost is real. The relationship between you and your craft was real. The years of refinement were real. The thing that made your work yours was real. The tools produced something that looks like the output. They did not produce what you brought to the output. Here is the mechanism. Not as consolation, as fact. Every AI system that generates creative or analytical work is producing output based on pattern recognition across an enormous body of existing work. What it cannot do, what no current system can do, is know when the output is right for this client, this brief, this moment, this particular reader who needs to feel a specific thing by the third paragraph. That knowledge lives somewhere specific. It lives in the years you spent learning what right feels like before you could explain why it was right. The thing the tools cannot replicate is judgment, not intelligence, not even taste in the broad sense. The specific, earned, profession-shaped judgment that distinguishes the version that works from the 17 versions that almost work. Here is the reframe that changes the shape of this. The grief is proportional to the investment. You are grieving because the craft meant something, because the years were real, because what you built was specifically yours in a way that cannot be mass-produced. That grief is not a sign of inflexibility. It is the exact proof that you have something the tools are going to need to be worth anything. The tools can replicate the output. Your expertise is what knows what to do with it. That is not a slogan. That is a mechanism. The combination of what you know, the judgment, the professional context, the earned sense of what right looks like, and what the tools can produce at speed is something that neither you nor the tool produces alone. Your craft did not become worthless when the tools arrived. It became the filter, the thing that makes the tool's output mean something instead of just existing. That's what your expertise is the foundation actually means. Not reassurance, architecture. The grief was real. The loss was real. And what remains after the grief, the judgment, the taste, the professional instincts that took years to build is exactly what this moment requires. For the professionals who hear that and feel ready to move from the acknowledgement into the reconstruction, there's a 90-day program in the description built specifically for this stage of the journey. Not for people who haven't started yet. For people who understand the loss, are ready to build on what remains, and want a guided, profession-specific path to doing it. The link is in the description and the pinned comment. So, what do you actually do with this? Not in 90 days. This week. The first thing, and this is more important than any tool, is to stop treating the grief as a problem to be solved before the integration can start. The grief and the integration are not sequential. They happen together. Integration is grief with direction. Here's what that looks like in practice. The next time you use a tool to generate a first draft, or a data summary, or a visual concept, notice what happens when you read what it produces. Notice the thing that immediately knows what's missing. Notice the edit you make without having to think about it. The word you change. The argument you restructure. The proportion you adjust by instinct. That instinct is not obsolete. That is the craft. That is the thing the tool cannot produce and cannot replicate and cannot replace. The integration point, the one real change that this week can hold, is this. Start treating your editorial response to AI output as a professional skill in its own right, not a correction pass, not quality control, a creative act that requires exactly the judgment you built, because that reframe changes the relationship to the tool. It stops being the thing that replaced you. It becomes the thing that gives you more surface area to do the part only you can do. The blank page used to be where the work started. Now it's the first draft. And the first draft has already done the pattern matching, the structural scaffolding, the approximation of the form. What starts the work now is the moment you read it and immediately know what it isn't yet. That moment, that specific, professional, earned knowing is yours. The tools did not take that from you. They just changed where in the process it lives. If you're ready to move from that understanding into a real system, one built around your specific profession and existing expertise, The resource in the description is where that begins. The link is also in the pinned comment. What was the specific moment, the demonstration, the deliverable, the quiet realization, when this grief first landed for you? A year from now, there will be professionals in your field who went through exactly this transition and came out the other side with something solid. Not because the grief was easy, not because the tools weren't disorienting, not because the professional landscape suddenly became honest about what was actually being lost, because they found the path that didn't require them to pretend the loss never happened in order to move forward from it. Those are not exceptional professionals. They are not people who adapted faster or felt less or had more appetite for disruption. They are people who found the specific reframe that made integration possible without asking them to abandon what the craft meant. The grief was real, and the craft is still there. Not where it used to live, in the doing of the first draft, in the blank page, in the hours of pure production, in something more durable, in the judgment that knows when the output is right, in the taste that knows what the draft is missing, in the professional instincts that took years to build and that no pattern-matching system has yet found a way to replicate. You didn't grieve because you were falling behind. You grieved because the work meant something. That's exactly why you're the right person to figure out what comes next. Not despite the years you invested in this craft, because of them. What comes next is not a fresh start. It's a continuation with better tools, a clearer understanding of what you bring to them, and the specific kind of confidence that only comes from having looked at the hard thing directly and found that it didn't end you. It clarified you. What you do with that is yours.